Hi, my name is Julia Banks, and I will be performing a policy analysis of the End-of-Life Options Act, North Carolina House Bill 789. Please note that during this analysis, the terms medical aid in dying, physician-assisted death, and physician-assisted dying will be used interchangeably. First, we will cover some basic principles of healthcare policy and ethics. Ethics is a set of morals, principles, beliefs, and values that guide us in making choices about medical care. A policy is a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, a party, business, or an individual. The four basic healthcare ethical principles are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Autonomy means to honor the patient's right to make their own decisions. Beneficence is to help the patient advance his or her own good or to simply to do good. Non-maleficence is to do no harm. And justice is to be fair and treat like cases alike. And some factors impacting health policy development are political or social culture and climate, such as who is in Congress and whether they are more liberal or more conservative. Resource availability, such as funding or individual or state or community resources, and ethics is another factor affecting development. Some factors impacting health policy implementation may be provider confidence, provider motivation and satisfaction, socio-demographic variables, varying types of illnesses, and population vulnerability. The question at hand is, should physician-assisted dying be legalized in North Carolina? The End-of-Life Option Act, North Carolina House Bill 789, is an act introducing policy addressing the allowance of patients with terminal illnesses to choose to end their own life in a dignified and humane manner with the ingestion of an aid in dying drug. The act was filed April of 2017 and passed the first reading and now remains with the Committee on Rules, Calendar, and Operations. The act contends that an individual 18 years or older suffering from an incurable terminal disease with a life expectancy of 6 months or less, deemed competent to make sound medical decisions regarding their health care needs, can request an aid in dying drug to hasten their death. In searching policies to analyze, I looked for topics that have affected me either in my personal or professional life or both. Being a nurse, death and dying is not foreign to me, and I have actually heard a few patients say, "I just want to die," after being delivered a terminal diagnosis. So it was my hope that analyzing the End-of-Life Option Act would give me some insight into how it would look if a patient actually had the choice to just die versus succumbing to whatever terminal diagnosis they had been given. Now we will look into some of the background of medical aid in dying. Medical aid in dying is fundamentally different from euthanasia. With aid in dying, the terminally ill person must take the medication themselves and therefore always remains in control. During my research on the topic, many sources still use the term physician-assisted suicide, which is greatly frowned upon. Some common arguments for medical aid in dying is the respect for autonomy that it gives the patient. Many believe that it is just and fair, and many supporters view it to show compassion for the terminally ill patient as it reduces suffering. On the contrary, some common arguments against medical aid in dying are it is unethical, there is a risk for hidden elder abuse, which this is not a very good argument. As the acts are written, it states that the patient must administer the drugs themselves, that they must not be coerced, and that they must be making an informed decision. Other arguments also include it not being congruent with medical care and that it is a violation of the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. Some states across the U.S. are active participants in medical aid in dying. Those include Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, and California. Some data found on medical aid in dying in the active states is as of January 19, 2018, in Oregon, prescriptions have been written for 1,967 people, and of that, 1,275 patients have died from ingesting the drugs that were legally prescribed to them under the law. In Washington State, since 2009, prescriptions have been written for 1,401 people, and there have been 1,364 reported deaths. And in Vermont, as of June 8, 2017, physician reporting forms have been completed for 53 people, according to the Department of Health. This map is a depiction of the states that are already on board with aid in dying drugs, the states who are thinking about it, and the states who have not. You can see the dark blue states are the ones where aid in dying drugs are authorized. The light blue states have bills that have been introduced, and the white states have no existing legislation. So now we will analyze the proposed End-of-Life Options Act of North Carolina. Now we will review some of the details of the End-of-Life Options Act. The right to information is to include the right for the patient to be informed of all available end-of-life options related to terminal care and to receive answers to specific questions about foreseeable risk and benefits of each option. The initiation of requests for aid in dying drugs include 2 verbal requests at least 15 days apart and 1 written request. The request must be made directly from the patient to the physician. The patient must be a North Carolina resident with proof and to have the physical and mental ability to self-administer the drug. After the second verbal request, the physician must offer discontinuation, withdrawal, or rescission of the request for aid in dying drug. Healthcare professional responsibility include the physician must make the initial determination of the illness, confirm that the patient is making an informed decision, refer the patient to a consulting physician for diagnosis confirmation, confirm that the patient has not been coerced, and again, verify that the patient is making an informed decision prior to writing the prescription. There are multiple documentation forms to be completed by the patient, the physician, the identified witness, the consulting physician, and a mental health specialist when applicable. No civil or criminal liability, penalty, or professional disciplinary action for good faith participation in activities authorized by the Act. Individuals can be federally prosecuted for altering or forging a request to hasten someone's death or for interfering or preventing the individual's death against his or her wishes. The key stakeholders in the End-of-Life Option Act include patients and physicians. This act focuses on the decision being made by the patient and communicated directly to the physician on multiple occasions in different manners. The physicians hold a huge responsibility in following protocol, accurate diagnosis, and ensuring the patient is making an informed decision. Other stakeholders would include the institutions that enact the policy, if it becomes law, and the identified witness also plays a significant role as they are taking on a large responsibility, agreeing to monitor the administration of the drug and follow protocol as well. We will now look at some key factors in the End-of-Life Options Act. We'll look at political, economic, practical, legal, and quality of care. When looking at political, one may question, should the government get to choose if a patient can have the right to choose to die? 2 states that have enacted the policy have allowed voters to choose by adding the topic to the ballot. Looking at economic factors, the cost of care versus the cost of a single medication is a topic of conversation. Studies have been published quoting in upwards of $34.7 million could be saved in healthcare spending by allowing the aid in dying drug. The act is very practical as there has been success in other states and only one instance found in my research of the medication not working where the patient regained consciousness. That is 1 out of 232 patients prescribed the drug in Oregon in the year 2017. When thinking of legal factors of the Act, it covers that very well, as it includes constructs regarding legal implications and protections, and explains reasons why one would be prosecuted. As for quality of care, this factor is ambiguous due to consideration of the controversy of the topic. Both arguments are thinking of the quality of life and the care for the patient. One supporting the Act could say that the Act allows for optimal quality care and decrease in suffering, while those against the Act may argue that dispensing the medication is not care at all. Now to discuss the ethical implications of the End-of-Life Option Act. In respect for autonomy, this Act allows individuals to make informed decisions regarding end of life. It could be argued that the ethical principles of beneficence, to do good, and non-maleficence, to do no harm, was not completely considered in the proposed Act, and that argument would depend on who the reader is and their personal views on the topic. An ethical dilemma one could point out in this Act is that, according to the details of the proposed Act, when the patient dies, the primary physician is to use the name of the terminal illness as the cause of death. This could be argued that it is unethical as it is not completely honest. But I can see the author's ideation, as it is also written in the Act that using the aid in dying drug shall not be deemed suicide and not affect coverage or issuance of insurance policies. One other ethical implication is regarding a minor's right to autonomy with decisions for end-of-life care. This is a topic that could be disputed for years and years to come. It was not addressed in the Act, however, it is important as there are plenty of arguments surrounding minors' rights to choice to their end-of-life decisions as well. A proposed modification would be requiring a complete mental health assessment by a mental health professional for all patients requesting the aid in dying drugs to end their life. As currently written, the patient is only required to undergo a mental health assessment by a mental health specialist if the primary physician determines there is evidence of mental disorder or disease. Research finds that although most patients do not have a depressive disorder, the current assessment of the Aid in Dying Acts may not protect mentally ill patients. It is suggested that the mental health assessment should include counseling, a thorough overview weighing the pros and cons of all other end-of-life care options, and an assessment of suicidality versus the desire to end the life in a humane and dignified manner. Desire to die statements by terminally ill patients are sometimes thought to have an underlying suicide ideation, although many times the desire to die is more related to fear of suffering, fear of painful procedures, or burden of healthcare costs. The suggestion could be implemented by adding the requirement to the approval requirements of the Act. The assessment would need to be documented in the patient's record, and the signature of the mental health professional and the primary care provider must be documented before the patient is deemed permitted to move forward with receiving the aid in dying drug. There are not any anticipated barriers to the implementation of the suggested modification. The minimum time frame for approval would be 15 days, and that is ample time for a mental health professional to perform the assessment. The development of this focused assessment should not present as a barrier, but it is an activity that would need to be completed before the final draft of this Act. This would require consulting with mental health professionals for the development of the assessment to include it as an official part of the Act. Evaluation of the suggested modification would include records review. Organizations would be required to complete quality and compliance audits to assess compliance with the added criterion. To prove successful, every patient record review would include a copy of the mental health assessment completed and signed by a mental health professional prior to approval of dispensing the aid in dying drug. When thinking of physician-assisted death, the questions who is right and who is wrong may surface. Those are questions that are very hard to answer. So the best we can do is remain informed through policy review and analysis and give our expertise and opinions where needed. And remember, everyone's voice has value.